Welcome to Washington Update. I'm the host, Bill Greiner, and I'm joined in studio today by New Hampshire Senior Senator Jeanne Shaheen. Welcome, Senator.
Nice to be here. Thanks, Bill.
So you are busy down in Washington these days. A lot of stuff going on, certainly some bipartisan stuff going on that people don't always hear about. Talk to us about some of the work that you've been doing relating to defense. Defense impacts New Hampshire substantially, as you know, and I know you've been involved in quite a series of things, including some bipartisan legislation with Rob Portman from Ohio. So maybe start off with that, and then let's talk about some of the other things.
Yeah, actually, we have just gotten agreement on a defense bill. It just went through the House, the 59th year in a row that we have a bipartisan bill that addresses not just defense, but a number of other things, some foreign policy issues that are affecting the country, and we expect to vote on that this week, upcoming week in the Senate. And it has some, I'm very happy. You know, you never get everything you want, but there are a number of things that I've worked on that I think are good for New Hampshire and good for the country. It supports the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard and Pease, the 157th Air Refueling Wing that's at Pease in our National Guard. That's very good news. There's funding for a new National Guard Center in Concord that's in the bill. There is the biggest pay raise for our men and women in the military in a decade, 3.1%. That's great news for all of the men and women who are serving. There's also an agreement that there will be 12 weeks of paid parental leave for every federal employee. And when you think about the fact that to date, if you've been working for the federal government and you have a baby, unlike so many places in the private sector, you don't get any maternity leave or paternity leave. So that's very good news, and hopefully that will be a model for the private sector. We also got a number of PFAS provisions that are in the bill that help us address the water contamination issues that we're having. You mentioned Rob Portman and me. We worked on legislation to help communities with grants and to help make sure that there is technical support for communities who are dealing with the PFAS issue. We got $10 million to continue the health study, which Pease is the model site for the rest of the country. There are 8 sites nationwide, so that we can look at the long-term impacts of PFAS and what it's really doing to people's health. So some really good things in this bill.
In southern New Hampshire, PFAS has been a big deal, and I'm sure you follow the St. Cobain situation closely.
Absolutely, and Merrimack as well.
What can you say about that and how you see that playing out?
Well, again, every American, everyone in New Hampshire who turns on the tap water ought to be able to feel comfortable that that water is going to be safe for drinking. And that's the concern. And we don't know enough yet about the impacts of PFAS. We have a pretty good idea that it's contaminant that's going to have adverse health effects, but we don't have the research, and that's why this health study is so important. Merrimack applied to be one of the sites, and unfortunately they weren't selected in this first round, but I think we're going to see more study in the future. So we need to make sure that we do everything possible at the state and federal level to help communities. And again, one of the things I'm proud of that's in the defense bill is this legislation that Rob Portman, Republican from Ohio, and I worked on to try and help communities like Merrimack, to try and make funding available to help with cleanup and other efforts that they need to make in the community to address PFAS.
Now, I also read that there was PFAS in firefighting.
Yes.
In the firefighting process, and that is no longer the case, again, because of work you've done. Can you talk about that?
Yes, there are 2 threats to firefighters from PFAS. One is in the firefighting foam. That's the PFAS chemicals are in firefighting foam. It's been very effective in fighting fires, but unfortunately it has this other contamination potential. So what we have gotten in the defense bill is a phase out of all PFAS chemicals for the military by 2024. That's very good news for our firefighters who are serving in the military. We also got some testing for firefighters serving in the military so they can get blood tested to see if they have any potential problems now or in the future. So they'll have a better understanding of what their health status is. The other concern is there is PFAS in actual firefighting equipment. So the suits firefighters wear, and again, we don't have enough research to know definitively if that's the case. There's some research that shows that's very much the case. It's awful to think that our firefighters would be threatened not just by what they're fighting fires with, by the PFAS in the foam, but also by the gear that they're wearing. So we were able to get funding in the Commerce, Justice, and Science Appropriations Bill, which I'm the top Democrat on that committee, and for NIST, the National Institute of Science and Technology, to actually test gear to see if in fact it has PFAS in firefighters' gear. So if the appropriations agreement that we got goes through, we'll be able to know definitively what the impact of that gear is and the chemicals that are part of it.
So one thing I want to talk about before we get into some more of the things that you've done specifically is bipartisanship. And specifically with you, you've always been a big advocate for the veterans and for the military, and it's important to our state. And so I think it's clear as to why that is, and you sit on armed services, which is very important for us. How do you go about and seek a sponsor like Rob Portman? So where does the military, and how does that fit into his state of Ohio? And how do you go about deciding who you're going to partner with or approach to partner with on legislation, and how does that come about?
Well, it's often based on people I work with on committees. For example, one of the things that is in the defense bill is a provision that will help spouses of people serving in the military. And we got interested in this issue because I have a coffee every Wednesday morning for people from New Hampshire or who have an interest to come into my office and meet the staff. And a couple came in, he's a Navy career officer who is from Manchester. And they came in and started talking to me, and his wife said, you know, he can decide that Manchester is going to be his residence as far as the military is concerned and declare that as a residence for his whole career. But I can't do that as his wife. I have to, every time he gets sent someplace else, I go with him. You know, I'm responsible for moving the family, and yet I'm the one who has to change my residency. She's a small business owner. She has to change her licensing and pay all the fees again every time they move. And she said, I don't think that's fair. Well, I agree. I don't think that's fair either. And so we started working on some legislation to try and help address that, to allow for spouses to set the residency the same as their husbands or wives, to allow occupational licenses to be moved from state to state without having to pay additional fees. And when we started working on it, we found out that Tom Cotton, Republican from Arkansas, was working on the same kind of legislation. So he and I partnered. We got our bill into the defense bill. He's also on the Armed Services Committee. And if the bill goes through, and I'm fairly certain it will next week, those provisions are going to become law, and we're going to provide some real help to military families because of the challenges their spouses have faced as they've had to move around. So it often happens like that. You work with people who you know have common interests.
And your experience in the Senate has been that of bipartisanship. And again, I think people here in New Hampshire see that because they see what you've done, but there's a lot of that goes on behind the scenes, or that just happens in the day-to-day course of business that most people don't see, or that doesn't show up on the cable news at 6 o'clock.
That's absolutely right, because it's not controversial. You know, people working together is not often seen as good a story as people fighting about things, but there is a lot more that goes on behind the scenes and people working together. You know, one of the things I learned as a state senator a long time ago was that if you want to get something done, you got to work together. And it's probably the number one issue I hear from people as I travel around the state is, why can't you all just work together to address the challenges facing this country? And that's how you get things done. You work together. You see it in Bedford, in the community, in the state, and it's true at the federal level as well. So whenever we work on an issue, we generally try to find a sponsor, a Republican sponsor, because we figure there's a much better shot at getting something done that way.
Sticking on the theme of defense, talk about some of the things that you've been able to get accomplished for the Shipyard.
Oh, well, we have a very good news story for the shipyard, because they are working on expanding the dry dock capacity. As I'm sure viewers know, submarines, and making sure that our submarine fleet, our nuclear submarine fleet, is out and working efficiently and repaired and up to date is very important. That submarine maintenance is something that we do at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, and we think we have, and I think it's been shown, we have the most efficient, best workforce of any public shipyard in the country. And one of the challenges has been that the facilities are old. It's the oldest public shipyard, dates back to 1600. So it's not surprising that a lot of the facilities are old, and we've gotten a lot of funding to help update those facilities. I was just there a couple of weeks ago with Senator Hassan and Senator Collins at the opening of a new paintball and rubber facility, which is going to be much more efficient in terms of helping with the maintenance. We are, as I said, expanding the dry dock, so we'll be able to address more submarines. And so, again, very good news. It means that our workforce has a secure future, and it's very good news for our national security, because it means that if we can get subs in and out, repaired on time or ahead of time, back into operation, it's good for our security. It's good in terms of the costs, because it means that we don't have to, our fleet doesn't have to be as big. So it's very important for lots of reasons.
It doesn't seem like it was that long ago where there was discussion about closing the shipyard. And you obviously went to bat as one of the folks that were integrally involved with that to make sure that didn't happen. How confident are you that we are at a place now where the importance of the shipyard, to your point earlier, is seen and is understood, and we're not going to be having that battle constantly, whether it stays or goes?
Well, I think there is a recognition about how effective and efficient the shipyard is and how important it is to our national security. But I think it's something that we need to stay alert to every cycle when we're planning a defense bill, because the Department of Defense continues to suggest that we should be looking at base closings. As we know, Pease was the first base closed in the country under the first BRAC law, and we want to make sure that people continue to understand how important the shipyard is. We had, as you remember, when the President was talking about taking funding from military construction projects, a number of which were at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, we invited then Navy Secretary Richard Spencer up to tour the shipyard with us, to see firsthand the work that goes on there, to see the importance of these military construction projects. And he unequivocally said, this is critical, we need to get these done, I'm committed to these. And the people at the shipyard, I think, breathed a sigh of relief when they heard that, because they knew that the projects were going forward and their jobs were secure. But I think it's something that we have to stay alert to all the time.
Can you talk a little bit about the military widow tax, something, again, I know it's been important to you?
Yes. Another positive win that we got in the defense bill, that what's been called the widow's tax, which is essentially an offset of benefits that families and spouses who have lost a member of the military because of service-connected death or because of battle time death have had their benefits offset. And so they don't get all of the benefits they should be entitled to through the VA and through the Department of Defense. And what we got in the defense bill is a phase out of that so-called widow's tax, which means that after 3 years, they will no longer have to worry. And you know, when you think about the sacrifices that our men and women in the military make, day in and day out, just 1% of our population are serving in the military. And you think about losing someone because of that service in the military, and then to lose the benefits that you were promised when you joined the military is just not fair. And I think there was a recognition that that was the case, and we needed to fix it.
Fentanyl, as you know, has been a big problem, particularly in New Hampshire, I believe that's also addressed in the defense bill?
Yes. Fentanyl, which has been responsible for so many of the overdose deaths we've had in this state. What the provisions in the defense bill try and do is to address fentanyl at its source. So to say to those Chinese companies that are manufacturing fentanyl, if you're going to do business with drug lords, if you're going to allow your fentanyl that you're manufacturing to be used to mix with other drugs that are going to people illegally, then we're going to sanction you. We're going to make sure that you can't do business in certain markets in the United States. We're going to make sure that there are sanctions against individuals of those companies. And I think it's designed to send a very strong message that we no longer want, we never wanted that kind of fentanyl to be distributed in the United States illegally.
Another topic that relates to veterans is air traffic controllers, and you've been pushing to see more veterans hired. Talk about that, and how did that come about in the first place to kind of make that push?
Well, again, I partnered with John Hoeven, who was a governor with me from North Dakota when I was governor and is now in the Senate as well. And he and I worked on trying to ensure that we can expedite hiring for air traffic controllers and that veterans are part of that expedited process, because we don't have enough air traffic controllers, and we need to make sure that we can encourage people to go into air traffic control. As you know, we have a big group here in New Hampshire. The Boston Center Tower is here in New Hampshire, and we have several hundred people there who are doing a great job, but being an air traffic controller is very challenging. I have a son-in-law who was an air traffic controller. Now he's a supervisor there, but I hear from him all the time the challenges that our air traffic controllers face with the number of planes in the air and the skills that it requires. So we need to make sure that hiring can go forward in a way that addresses the needs we have for the workforce.
A few years ago, there was talk about privatization of air traffic controllers. You don't hear that as much now, at least we don't hear it back here in New Hampshire. Do you think that it's something that will be raised again, particularly with this administration? And what are your personal thoughts on that?
I don't think privatization makes sense. I think for something that is so important to public health and safety as our air traffic control system, it's important for us to have a clear oversight of what goes on there, and to make sure that we can do everything possible to ensure that the system is safe and that people know what they're getting when they get on an airplane. As somebody who flies very regularly back and forth to Washington and lots of other places, I know how important it is to ensure that we have a safe system.
So we have seen the government shut down. We've seen it come close to shutting down. There was talk about that over the last month or so. It looks like, again, through bipartisan support, that's not going to happen. Can you talk to us about where we are and what your thoughts were maybe a few weeks ago, and did you think that we might be headed for a real shutdown?
Well, I didn't think we were headed for a shutdown. I was worried that we were going to be headed for another continuing resolution, which is not good for the government, for our Department of Defense men and women in the military. It's not good for those companies that contract with the federal government to not know to not have budget certainty.
So what's the difference? Explain the difference between a CR, continuing resolution, and the budget, and then go into the,
Well, a continuing resolution basically says we're going to continue to fund the government, but we're going to fund it at the same levels that we funded it last year.
It's almost like a default budget.
Very much. But one of the real challenges, and this is true particularly for the Department of Defense, but also for many other agencies, is that you can't start anything new. You can't have any new programs begin under a continuing resolution. So that presents real challenges. And it looks like we have a budget agreement, which is the good news for this coming year. We're already 3 months into this new calendar year. But to be able to have a budget agreement for the remainder of 2020 is very good news. Now, we haven't seen all of the details of that. We hope to see those this coming week, early this week. And so I'll know more about exactly what's in it, but I can tell you, as I said, as the Democrat on Commerce, Justice, and Science, we have part of our portfolio is the Department of Commerce, the Department of Justice, and science programs, things like NOAA and NASA and the National Science Foundation are all part of our portfolio. And I can tell you that we reached agreement on most of what's in the bill months ago. Jerry Moran, who is the Republican senator from Kansas, is the chairman of the committee, and he and I really agreed on almost everything in the bill ultimately. The other big piece of our bill coming up is the census. That's part of our portfolio because it's done through the Department of Commerce. And there have been a lot of issues, as I'm sure you've seen, about the census, whether there was going to be a citizenship question on the census that got resolved by the courts, whether we were going to provide the funding. And I can tell you that we are on track to do exactly what we need to do with this census. The funding is available, it's there, assuming we agree to the 2020 appropriations. The funding is going to be there that we need to ensure that we count everyone in this country. And you know, it's one of the very few functions that's actually outlined in the Constitution, that we should take a census of our population every 10 years.
Talk about the trade agreement that was just reached with essentially the replacement of NAFTA or the revised NAFTA.
Yeah, we haven't seen it yet. We're just looking at it now because it was just, it hasn't officially been released. That's happening now, and the House is going to be voting on it. I don't think the Senate is going to take this up until after January. But it sounds like it's going to be better for us than NAFTA was. Have to take a drink. My allergies are kicking in
That's
here.
Okay. So that'd be something, the House will take it up first and then send it over to you.
Right. But the good news is that it seems to have stronger both environmental and labor provisions than NAFTA did. And I think that's good for working men and women in this country. We've already seen President Trumpka of the AFL-CIO has endorsed it. And so we'll wait and see exactly what's in it. But I hope that's good for New Hampshire and good for the country.
Good. Can you talk a little bit about robocalls?
Oh,
and,
yes.
Another hot topic.
A very hot topic. You know, you have a long day, you get home, you go in, you sit down, you get ready for dinner, and all of a sudden the phone starts ringing. And it's just robocall after robocall. Tens of millions, actually, even in New Hampshire already this year. And what this legislation would do is allow us to go after, with stronger enforcement measures, those people who are engaging in robocalls. It would allow us to, or it would say to telecom companies, you have to make available to people who would like it, the technology that can block those robocalls. So it's really very good news. And I think as we think about robocalls aren't just an annoyance, but they're also scams for so many people, particularly seniors who get those calls and they think they have to pay money to the IRS or to Social Security or to Medicare or to whoever because they see that number come up on their TV. And this happened to me a couple of weeks ago. I was sitting there and the phone rang and the number came up on the television. It said U.S. government. So I picked up the phone thinking, well, maybe it's somebody from my office, somebody trying to reach me. No, it was a scam. It was somebody saying to me, you know, you have to call this person right away or you're going to be in big trouble. That was essentially the message. And a lot of people get those calls and they don't realize they're scams. And that's what this would also help us crack down on. So I think it's very good news. The legislation has passed both the House and Senate. I think we're waiting for final approval in the Senate, but I expect that to happen this week.
Are there any big items that you're looking ahead to after the first of the year? Other things you want to tackle, other legislation that you'd like to get involved with?
Well, Rob Portman, who I mentioned earlier, he and I have been working this is the 5th Congress now, on energy efficiency legislation. If you look at where can we help deal with our energy needs, what's the cheapest, fastest way to do that? It's energy efficiency. It's not using energy, saving it. And so he and I have legislation that would, if we can pass it, and it has strong bipartisan support. It came out of committee again with a strong bipartisan vote. We haven't been able to get it to the floor because it gets caught up in other energy issues that have been much more contentious. But if we can get it to the floor, according to a study that was done in 2013, it would be the equivalent of taking 22 million cars off the road. It would save consumers about $16 billion a year, and it would create hundreds of jobs, or actually thousands. So it would be very good news.
Sounds like you and Senator Portman need to have offices next to each other for what you're working on together.
Well, we're on several committees together, which is helpful.
And again, I think that is good for people to hear, that despite the noise that's out there, there is a lot of stuff that happens because people can come together regardless of party because you're trying to do the right thing. Absolutely.
And, I joke that Senator Portman is an honorable Granite Stater because he went to Dartmouth. So we claim him.
Good. Anything else you'd like to hit on at the in the close here, or you're looking forward to spending some time with the family over the holidays?
I am, and I'm sure that everybody in New Hampshire feels that way. This is a time when people in New Hampshire come together. I think we're more helpful to our neighbors. We try and look at ways in which we can support our communities, and that's really good for the state. One of my favorite stories was the one that appeared this week with the police in Manchester, who take seniors around to see the various holiday lights that are on homes all over the Manchester area. And what a great story. They then bring them back, they have a little party, and everybody enjoys it. And listening to some of those seniors talk about how much they enjoyed seeing all the holiday lights, being with the Manchester police, that's the kind of thing that we do so well in New Hampshire. It's neighbor helping neighbor. It's people looking after each other. It's trying to bring joy into people's lives who may need a little joy at this time of year.
Well, great. Well, thank you for your time. I know that your time is valuable, and we appreciate you coming in and talking to us and really giving folks at home an update as to what's going on in Washington and how you are representing the people. That's important, I think, to everybody, regardless of party, knowing that we've got good representation in Washington, D.C. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Bill, and happy holidays to you and your family.
Thanks, and you as well.